It is just after 10 o'clock on the night of the 6th of July, 1988. On the Piper Alpha platform in the North Sea, 226 men are either working or sleeping. In the next 2 hours, 167 of them will be dead. The platform, once the most productive oil platform in the world, will be destroyed completely, and the offshore energy industry will never be the same again. Piper Alpha is the worst offshore disaster in history, but it is not the only one. And the story of how these disasters happened and what the industry did and sometimes didn't do in response is one that everyone who works offshore or depends on offshore energy should understand. By the end of this video, you will know the 5 worst disasters in offshore energy history, what caused each one, how many lives were lost, and what changed or didn't change because of them. Let's start with Piper Alpha, because nothing else comes close. The Piper Alpha platform sat in the North Sea, 193 kilometers northeast of Aberdeen. At its peak, it produced around 10% of all North Sea oil and gas, roughly 300,000 barrels per day. It was connected by pipelines to several other platforms in the area, which would become a critical and fatal detail on the night it burned. The disaster began not with a catastrophic failure, but with a maintenance error. A condensate pump had been taken offline for routine maintenance. The safety valve was removed and a metal plate fitted in its place as a temporary seal. A permit to work was issued. What nobody on the night shift knew was that the pump had not been fully isolated, and when pressure built up in the system and the condensate pump was mistakenly restarted, gas escaped through the incomplete seal and ignited. The first explosion hit at 9:58 p.m. It was serious, but survivable. The platform had emergency procedures. Men began to muster, but the platform's firewall, designed to contain a fire, not an explosion, had been blown apart. And then came the decision that turned a serious incident into a catastrophe. The operators of the connected pipelines, seeing the fire on Piper Alpha, faced a choice: shut down the pipelines feeding gas to the burning platform, or wait for confirmation from the platform itself. Confirmation never came. The pipelines kept flowing. At 10:04 p.m. a second, far larger explosion tore through the platform as a gas riser ruptured. Then a third. The platform was engulfed. Men who survived the initial explosions were trapped in accommodation modules filling with smoke. The muster stations were inaccessible. The lifeboats were unreachable. Some men jumped 45 meters into the burning sea below. Some were rescued by a standby vessel whose crew operated at the edge of what was survivable. Most did not make it. 167 men died. The Cullen inquiry that followed produced 106 recommendations, all of which were accepted. The permit to work system across the entire industry was overhauled. The concept of a temporary refuge, a hardened, smoke-protected space where workers can shelter during an emergency, became mandatory. Offshore safety regulation was fundamentally restructured. Piper Alpha did not just change how platforms were operated, it changed how the entire industry thought about risk. The second disaster on this list happened 2 years earlier, and 6,000 kilometers away. On the 19th of February, 1982, the Ocean Ranger semi-submersible drilling rig capsized in the North Atlantic, 267 kilometers east of St. John's, Newfoundland. All 84 men on board were lost. Not one survived. The Ocean Ranger was, at the time of its completion in 1976, the largest semi-submersible drilling rig in the world. It had been certified as unsinkable by its operators. On the night of the 14th of February, a severe storm, with waves reported at over 15 meters, struck the rig. A port light, a small window in the ballast control room, was broken by a wave. Seawater entered the ballast control room and damaged the control panel, triggering uncontrolled ballast changes that the crew could not reverse. The rig began to list. Attempts to correct the ballast failed. The list increased. Lifeboats were launched, but in 15-meter seas and minus 20-degree temperatures. Several capsized immediately on hitting the water. Rescue vessels were nearby but could not reach survivors in time. The Ocean Ranger sank at 1:30 a.m. on the 15th of February. The inquiry found that the crew had not been adequately trained in ballast control emergency procedures. The lifeboats were not suited to the sea conditions they were deployed in. The design of the ballast control room, accessible through a port light that could be damaged by wave action, was a fundamental flaw that had never been addressed. 84 men paid for those failures with their lives. The third disaster on this list is the one most people outside the offshore industry have heard of. At 9:49 p.m. on the 20th of April, 2010, a blowout occurred on the Macondo well being drilled by the Deepwater Horizon drill ship in the Gulf of Mexico, 66 kilometers off the coast of Louisiana. The blowout preventer failed to seal the well. Gas and oil surged up the riser to the surface and ignited. The explosion killed 11 workers instantly. 17 more were seriously injured. The Deepwater Horizon burned for 36 hours before sinking to the seabed. But the deaths and the loss of the vessel were not the full extent of the catastrophe. The Macondo well continued to flow uncontrolled for 87 days. Approximately 4.9 million barrels of oil, roughly 780 million liters, were released into the Gulf of Mexico. It was the largest accidental marine oil spill in history. The environmental damage to the Gulf Coast, to fisheries, to marine ecosystems, and to the communities that depended on them was measured in decades, not years. The subsequent investigation found failures at every level. Decisions made to save time and money had compromised well integrity. Warning signs that the well was not behaving correctly were misread or ignored in the hours before the blowout. The blowout preventer, the last line of defense, had a design flaw that rendered it unable to seal the well under the conditions it faced. BP, Transocean, and Halliburton all bore responsibility. The legal and financial consequences ran to tens of billions of dollars. The fourth disaster happened before any of them, and for decades it defined what offshore disaster looked like. On the 27th of March, 1980, the Alexander Kielland accommodation platform capsized in the Ekofisk oil field in the North Sea. 123 men died. It remains the worst peacetime maritime disaster in Norwegian history. The Alexander Kielland was not a drilling or production platform. It was a flotel, a floating hotel, providing accommodation for workers on nearby installations. It was a 5-legged semi-submersible, and on the afternoon of the 27th of March, one of its 5 bracing columns failed catastrophically due to a fatigue crack that had developed around a weld connecting a hydrophone to the structure. The crack had been there for some time. It had never been detected. The loss of the column caused the platform to list immediately and violently. Lifeboats on the low side were crushed against the platform. The platform capsized in minutes. Of the 212 men on board, only 89 survived. The water temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. In those conditions, survival time in the water, without a survival suit, was measured in minutes. The investigation found that the fatigue crack had originated at a fillet weld of unacceptably poor quality. Inspection had failed to find it. The capsize sequence was so rapid that many men had no chance to reach lifeboats regardless of training or procedure. The disaster drove significant changes in structural inspection standards and the design of offshore survival equipment across the North Sea. The fifth disaster on this list is more recent, and a reminder that the hazards of offshore energy are not confined to oil and gas. In September 2020, the Bourbon Road, a supply vessel working in the Atlantic, sank during Hurricane Lorenzo, with the loss of 3 crew members and a further 9 missing and presumed dead. But more significantly for the offshore wind industry, the installation vessel Seajax Scylla suffered serious damage during an extreme weather event in the same year, highlighting the growing exposure of the expanding offshore wind construction fleet to the same environmental hazards that the oil and gas industry has managed for decades. The offshore wind industry is scaling at a rate that the oil and gas industry never did. New vessel types, new installation methods, new working environments. The lessons of Piper Alpha, Ocean Ranger, and Deepwater Horizon were written in lives. The offshore wind industry has the opportunity and the obligation to learn from them before it writes its own. Every safety procedure followed offshore. Every permit to work completed correctly. Every ballast check, every well integrity test, every structural inspection. These are not bureaucratic exercises. They are the direct result of disasters that killed real people, on real platforms, in real seas. The ocean does not forgive shortcuts. The names on these platforms are proof of that. 167 men on Piper Alpha, 84 on the Ocean Ranger, 11 on the Deepwater Horizon, 123 on the Alexander Kielland. They went to work. They did not come home. And the industry that followed them offshore owes them more than a moment of remembrance. It owes them the discipline to never let it happen again.